Sometimes the loneliest animals are the ones still breathing. The workers at Haven Ridge Animal Shelter had seen sick animals before, abandoned pets before, even animals too frightened to trust another living soul. But none of them had ever seen a cat like Milo. The frail gray tabby spent every hour curled tightly into the farthest corner of his kennel, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his tiny ribs. His cloudy white eyes never followed movement. They never reacted to light. And over the past few weeks, Milo had stopped reacting to sound too. "I think he's giving up," Sarah Coleman whispered one rainy evening as she stood outside the kennel holding a clipboard against her chest. The fluorescent shelter lights reflected off the steel cages lining the room, but Milo didn't even lift his head when she spoke. The shelter had rescued him 3 months earlier after neighbors reported hearing cries coming from an empty apartment in downtown Portland. By the time authorities entered the building, Milo's elderly owner had already passed away from natural causes. The blind cat had been trapped alone inside the apartment for nearly 4 days. No food, no fresh water, no familiar voice calling his name anymore. Since arriving at the shelter, Milo had barely eaten enough to survive. Dr. Lucas Reed had tried everything. Soft food, medication, warm blankets, gentle handling. Nothing worked. The cat simply stared into darkness as though the world itself had disappeared. "He used to purr all the time," Sarah said quietly while reading through Milo's intake file again. "The neighbors said he followed his owner everywhere." Dr. Reed sighed from across the room. "Animals grieve harder than people realize." Outside, thunder rattled the shelter windows while the evening staff prepared to close for the night. Most of the dogs barked endlessly during storms, but one kennel remained unusually silent. Buddy, a large golden-colored mixed-breed rescue dog, sat perfectly still near the end of the hallway. Unlike the other dogs, Buddy never barked much. He had arrived only 2 days earlier after being transferred from another overcrowded shelter nearly 60 miles away. Calm, friendly, older. That was all the paperwork said. But tonight, something about Buddy had changed. Sarah noticed it immediately when she walked past his kennel carrying a tray of food bowls. The dog wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at the other dogs either. His eyes were locked directly across the room toward Milo's cage. Completely still, completely focused. "Buddy," Sarah said softly. The dog didn't react. Slowly, Buddy stood up and walked toward the front gate of his kennel. Then, without making a sound, he pressed his nose through the bars and stared at the blind cat again. Milo remained motionless in his corner. But then something strange happened. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the cat slowly lifted his head. Sarah froze. Dr. Reed lowered the clipboard in his hands. The entire room suddenly felt quieter than before. Buddy took one step back, then another, before letting out a low whine so soft it barely sounded like a dog at all. Milo's ears twitched. Sarah felt chills crawl up her arms. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Dr. Reed nodded slowly, unable to take his eyes off the cages. Then Buddy did something that made both of them stop breathing for a moment. The dog suddenly slammed his body against the kennel gate and began clawing frantically at the metal latch while staring directly at Milo. Sarah instinctively stepped backward as Buddy continued throwing his weight against the kennel gate, the metal rattling loudly through the dim hallway. Several dogs nearby immediately started barking in panic while Milo shrank deeper into the corner of his cage, his thin body trembling beneath the old blanket. "Easy, Buddy, easy," Sarah said nervously, setting the tray of food bowls onto the floor. But the dog did not sound angry. He was not snarling. He was not showing his teeth. Instead, he kept whining desperately while staring at Milo, as if he were trying to reach him. Dr. Lucas Reed slowly approached the kennel, careful not to startle the dog. "That is not aggression," he muttered quietly. "That is something else." Buddy pawed at the latch again, then suddenly stopped and pressed his face against the bars, letting out another soft cry that echoed strangely through the room. Milo's ears twitched once more. Sarah stared in disbelief. The blind cat had ignored almost every sound around him for weeks. Loud dogs, staff voices, feeding carts, thunderstorms. Nothing reached him anymore. Yet somehow he reacted to Buddy every single time the dog made a sound. "I do not understand this," Sarah whispered. Dr. Reed folded his arms while studying both animals carefully. "Neither do I." The storm outside grew heavier, rain hammering against the shelter windows while flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the long hallway of cages. Sarah slowly knelt beside Milo's kennel and gently slid a small bowl of wet food closer to him. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "Just a little." Normally Milo would not move at all, but tonight the cat slowly lifted his nose into the air. Buddy immediately became still, completely still. The large dog sat down against the kennel door as if he understood the importance of the moment. Milo sniffed once, then again. Finally, with slow, uncertain movements, the cat dragged himself toward the bowl. Sarah covered her mouth in shock. "Oh my God," she breathed. It was the first time Milo had approached food on his own in nearly 5 days. Dr. Reed crouched beside her, careful not to interrupt. Milo took one tiny bite before stopping again, exhausted from the effort. But even that tiny movement felt impossible compared to the hopeless animal they had watched fading away for weeks. Buddy's tail thumped softly against the concrete floor. "I think he knows," Sarah whispered. "Knows what?" Dr. Reed asked quietly. Sarah looked toward the dog. "That Milo is broken." The veterinarian remained silent for a moment before slowly standing back up. Sometimes animals recognize pain faster than people do. Buddy continued staring toward Milo without blinking. There was something deeply focused in the dog's expression, almost unsettling in its intensity. He ignored every sound around him, ignored the barking dogs, ignored the thunder, ignored Sarah completely whenever she called his name. All he cared about was the small blind cat curled beside the food bowl across the hallway. Over the next hour, the behavior only became stranger. Every time Milo shifted even slightly inside his kennel, Buddy reacted instantly. If the cat stumbled, Buddy stood up. If Milo cried softly in confusion, Buddy whined back immediately. Twice, Sarah tried leading Buddy away from the kennel area so she could finish cleaning duties, but the dog refused to move more than a few feet before pulling back toward Milo again. "I have never seen attachment happen this fast," she admitted. Dr. Reed nodded uneasily. "Neither have I." Then, just as Sarah reached for the light switch to close the hallway for the night, a loud metallic crash suddenly echoed from the back storage room. Milo panicked instantly. The blind cat slammed into the side of his kennel in terror, disoriented and shaking violently. But before Sarah could even react, Buddy exploded into action. The dog began barking frantically and throwing himself against the kennel latch harder than before, his cries now loud enough to shake the entire shelter hallway. Buddy slammed against the kennel door again and again while the barking in the shelter spiraled into chaos around him. Milo crouched low against the floor of his cage, shaking so badly that the thin metal food bowl rattled beneath his paws. Sarah hurried toward the storage room where the crashing sound had come from and found a fallen mop bucket rolling slowly across the wet concrete floor. "It is okay," she called back quickly. Nothing happened. But Buddy did not calm down. The moment Sarah returned to the hallway, the large dog let out another sharp bark and clawed desperately at the latch. "What is wrong with him?" one of the overnight volunteers asked nervously from the front desk doorway. Dr. Reed remained focused on Buddy, his expression growing more concerned by the second. "I think he is trying to get to the cat." Sarah frowned. Why would he need to get to Milo? Before anyone could answer, Milo suddenly stumbled sideways inside his kennel and hit the water dish hard enough to spill it across the floor. The blind cat cried softly in confusion, unable to orient himself after the loud noise. Instantly, Buddy froze. The barking stopped. The dog pressed himself flat against the kennel gate and released a long, low whine unlike anything Sarah had heard before. Milo slowly turned his head toward the sound. Then, incredibly, the trembling in his body began to ease. "No way," the volunteer whispered under his breath. Sarah stared between the two cages with chills crawling up her neck again. "He is calming him down." Dr. Reed finally stepped closer to Buddy's kennel and carefully opened the outer latch just enough to slide his hand through. Normally, rescue dogs under stress snapped or pulled away during moments like this, but Buddy ignored the veterinarian completely. His eyes never left Milo. "Buddy," Dr. Reed said softly, "what are you trying to do?" The dog whined again and nudged the kennel door with his nose. Sarah hesitated before speaking. "Should we let him out?" Both volunteers immediately looked alarmed. "With the cat?" one asked. "What if he hurts him?" Sarah understood the concern. Milo weighed barely 8 pounds now and could barely defend himself even against normal shelter stress. Buddy, meanwhile, was close to 70 pounds with broad shoulders and enough strength to knock over a grown adult if startled. But Dr. Reed continued watching the dog carefully. "I do not think he wants to hurt Milo," he said quietly. "I think he is upset because he cannot reach him." Another crack of thunder shook the windows overhead. Milo flinched violently again, pressing himself against the back wall of his kennel. Buddy immediately began whining louder. Sarah looked torn. Every shelter protocol warned against introducing stressed animals too quickly, especially at night during storms. But something about Buddy's behavior no longer felt random. It felt purposeful. Just for 1 minute, Dr. Reed finally decided. "If anything feels wrong, we separate them immediately." Sarah swallowed nervously and slowly approached Buddy's kennel. The moment she unlatched the door, the dog rushed forward so quickly that everyone stiffened in panic. But instead of charging wildly through the room, Buddy ran directly toward Milo's cage and stopped inches from the bars. Completely silent now, completely focused, Milo lifted his head, slowly toward the sound of paws against concrete. Buddy lowered himself onto the floor outside the kennel and rested his chin between his front paws. The shelter hallway suddenly became strangely quiet. Even the other dogs seemed calmer. Sarah carefully opened Milo's kennel door only a few inches. "Easy," she whispered nervously. Milo did not move at first. The blind cat remained frozen beside the overturned water bowl while Buddy waited motionless outside the cage. Then, slowly, Milo took one uncertain step forward. Buddy remained perfectly still. Another step, then another. Sarah held her breath as the fragile cat finally reached the edge of the kennel opening. Milo stretched his nose forward carefully into the air until it brushed lightly against Buddy's fur. The large dog closed his eyes for a moment and let out the softest sound anyone in the room had ever heard, almost like relief. For several seconds, nobody in the shelter moved. Sarah could hear the rain pounding the roof overhead and the distant hum of traffic outside, but inside the hallway, everything felt frozen around the two animals. Milo kept his nose pressed lightly against Buddy's fur as though he was trying to memorize the dog's scent. Buddy did not move an inch. The large rescue dog simply remained lying on the cold concrete floor with his tail wagging slowly beside him. "I cannot believe this," one of the volunteers whispered quietly. Dr. Reed lowered himself carefully onto one knee without taking his eyes off them. "Do not make sudden movements," he warned softly. Sarah nodded, barely breathing. Milo had rejected every form of contact since arriving at the shelter. He hissed when staff approached too quickly. He hid whenever strangers spoke near his kennel. Even gentle touch usually sent him retreating into panic. Yet now the blind cat was voluntarily standing inches away from a dog nearly 10 times his size. Buddy slowly lifted his head and nudged the edge of Milo's front paw with his nose. Milo flinched at first, but instead of retreating, he remained standing there. Then something happened that made Sarah feel tears forming in her eyes. Milo began purring. The sound was weak and uneven, almost rusty from disuse, but unmistakable. Sarah covered her mouth immediately. "That is the first time," she whispered shakily. "I have not heard him purr once since he came here." Buddy's ears perked up at the sound. The dog carefully shifted closer to the kennel opening while remaining low to the ground, almost as if he understood Milo frightened easily. Dr. Reed studied Buddy carefully with growing confusion. "This dog is adjusting every movement for the cat," he said quietly. "Look at him." Sarah noticed it too. Buddy never moved suddenly. Every time Milo hesitated, the dog stopped instantly. Every sound Buddy made was soft and low, almost gentle enough for the blind cat to follow safely. The veterinarian slowly stood back up and folded his arms. "I think Buddy understands Milo cannot see." The volunteer frowned. "How could he know that?" Dr. Reed exhaled slowly. "Animals notice things we miss." Over the next half hour, Sarah remained sitting cross-legged on the floor watching the pair together. The storm outside finally began fading into a steady drizzle, but Buddy still refused to leave Milo's side. Each time the blind cat became startled by a distant sound, Buddy quietly nudged him back toward the blanket inside the kennel. Once, when Milo accidentally bumped into the steel food bowl again, Buddy gently pushed it away with his nose before the noise could frighten the cat further. "This is unbelievable," Sarah whispered. But not everyone felt comfortable with what they were seeing. Around midnight, Another overnight staff member named Kevin entered the hallway carrying cleaning supplies. The moment he noticed Buddy outside his kennel near Milo, his face tightened immediately. "Why is that dog loose?" he asked sharply. Sarah quickly stood up. "It is okay. They are calming each other down." Kevin stared at Buddy suspiciously. "That dog has been here 2 days. You do not know anything about him yet." Buddy looked up briefly at the sound of Kevin's voice, but immediately turned his attention back toward Milo again. Kevin lowered the cleaning bucket onto the floor with a loud thud. Milo instantly panicked and stumbled backward into the side of the kennel. Before anyone could react, Buddy jumped to his feet and stepped directly between Kevin and the cat. A deep warning growl rumbled from the dog's chest. The hallway fell silent again. Kevin froze. "See," he snapped. "That is exactly what I mean." Sarah's stomach tightened nervously. Buddy was not barking wildly or showing uncontrolled aggression, but the dog's posture had changed completely. Protective, focused, intense. Dr. Reed slowly stepped forward with his hands raised calmly. "Buddy," he said softly. "Easy." But the dog refused to move away from Milo's kennel. His eyes remained fixed directly on Kevin while the blind cat trembled quietly behind him. Kevin shook his head in frustration. "This is dangerous. That cat is stressing him out." Sarah looked uncertain now. She wanted to believe Buddy was helping Milo, but the tension in the hallway felt different suddenly. He was no longer acting like a calm rescue dog. He was acting like a guardian. Kevin refused to take another step closer after hearing the growl. "That is not normal behavior," he said firmly while keeping his distance from Buddy. "You cannot let a dog guard another animal like this inside a shelter." Sarah glanced anxiously between Kevin and the dog. Buddy remained standing in front of Milo's kennel, completely still except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. The blind cat stayed hidden behind him, trembling quietly against the blanket inside the cage. Dr. Reed kept his voice calm. "Nobody is saying this situation is normal." "Then separate them," Kevin argued immediately, "before something goes wrong." For a moment Sarah thought the veterinarian might agree, but Dr. Reed continued studying Buddy carefully. The dog was not lunging. He was not snapping. Every ounce of his focus remained fixed on shielding Milo from what he viewed as a threat. "Look at his posture," Dr. Reed said quietly. "He is not trying to attack anyone. He is blocking access." Kevin crossed his arms. "That does not make it safe." Sarah understood both sides. Shelter rules existed for a reason. Stressed rescue animals could behave unpredictably, especially during storms and overnight shifts when the environment became overwhelming. But deep down, she could not ignore what she had already witnessed. Milo had eaten for the first time in days. He had purred. He had willingly approached another living creature. None of that had happened until Buddy arrived. "Maybe we should monitor them for the night," Sarah suggested carefully. Kevin shook his head in disbelief. "You are seriously treating this like some kind of miracle story?" Before Sarah could answer, Milo suddenly moved inside the kennel again. The blind cat cautiously stepped closer to Buddy until his small body brushed against the dog's back leg. Instantly, the growling stopped. Buddy relaxed at once, lowering himself back onto the floor beside the kennel opening. The change happened so quickly that everyone in the hallway fell silent again. Kevin frowned. "That is weird." Dr. Reed nodded slowly. "Very weird." Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the storm finally passed completely, leaving the shelter wrapped in an eerie silence broken only by distant dripping water outside. Sarah volunteered to stay late and continue watching the animals while Kevin finished paperwork at the front office. Dr. Reed pulled Sarah aside near the supply closet. "I want to try something," he said quietly. "What kind of something?" she asked nervously. The veterinarian glanced toward Buddy and Milo. "I want to see if this behavior continues when nobody is around." 20 minutes later, the hallway lights dimmed and the shelter settled into nighttime quiet. Sarah and Dr. Reed watched remotely from the small security office through the overhead camera feeds connected to the kennel hallway. On screen, Buddy remained lying beside Milo's cage exactly where they had left him. "He has not moved in almost 15 minutes, Sarah whispered. Dr. Reed leaned closer toward the monitor. "Wait." Milo slowly stood up inside the kennel and began moving uncertainly toward the water bowl near the opposite side of the cage. Since the cat could not see, he bumped awkwardly into the corner wall halfway there and froze in confusion. Buddy immediately stood up outside the kennel. The dog let out one soft whine. Milo turned toward the sound. Buddy moved slowly along the outside edge of the kennel toward the water bowl area. Inside the cage, Milo followed the sound step by step. Sarah's eyes widened. No way. Buddy stopped moving once Milo reached the bowl safely. The blind cat lowered his head and began drinking. Neither Sarah nor Dr. Reed spoke for several seconds. Then the veterinarian quietly replayed the footage again. Buddy had not acted randomly. Every movement had been deliberate, controlled, measured. He guided him, Sarah whispered in disbelief. Dr. Reed slowly sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. I think Buddy figured out the cat was blind almost immediately. Sarah looked back toward the monitor just as Milo finished drinking and curled up near the kennel door beside Buddy again. The large dog lowered his head protectively against the bars and closed his eyes. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, Milo fell asleep peacefully. But while Sarah watched the screen with tears forming in her eyes, Dr. Reed's expression suddenly changed. He leaned closer toward the monitor one more time and noticed something that made his face tighten with concern. Buddy was not sleeping at all. Every few seconds, the dog opened his eyes and scanned the dark hallway like he was standing guard. Sarah barely slept after that. Even from the small security office, she could not stop watching the monitor feed showing Buddy lying outside Milo's kennel like a silent protector through the rest of the night. Every time another animal barked somewhere in the shelter, Buddy lifted his head instantly. Every time Milo shifted in his sleep, the dog quietly moved closer to the cage bars again. By sunrise, Dr. Reed looked just as unsettled as she felt. I have worked with rescue animals for almost 20 years, he admitted while rubbing his tired eyes. And I have never seen behavior like this happen so fast. Morning staff slowly arrived around 7 o'clock, and word about the strange pair spread through the shelter almost immediately. Some employees smiled when they saw Milo sleeping peacefully beside Buddy. Others looked worried. Kevin remained firmly against keeping them together. You are all ignoring warning signs because the story feels emotional, he argued while preparing food trays in the kitchen area. That dog is becoming possessive. Sarah wanted to disagree, but part of her understood the concern. Buddy now refused to leave Milo's side completely. Whenever staff tried guiding him back toward his original kennel, the dog planted himself against the floor and stared anxiously toward the blind cat until they gave up. During feeding time, Buddy even pushed his own food bowl aside and watched Milo eat first. That is not normal, Kevin muttered again. Dr. Reed remained quiet for most of the morning, carefully observing every interaction. The veterinarian noticed something nobody else seemed to catch. Buddy never acted possessive toward food, space, or toys. The only time the dog became tense was when Milo appeared frightened or confused. Around noon, Sarah attempted something small. She carefully carried Milo out of the kennel and placed him onto a thick blanket in the staff lounge so the cat could rest in a quieter environment. The moment Milo realized Buddy was not nearby, panic spread through his body instantly. The blind cat froze low against the blanket, trembling so badly that his paws slipped against the fabric. It is okay, Sarah whispered gently while stroking his back. But Milo cried softly and turned his cloudy eyes back and forth in confusion. Then the door opened behind them. Buddy entered the room beside Dr. Reed, and everything changed immediately. Milo lifted his head at once. Buddy walked slowly across the room and lay down beside the blanket without making a sound. Within seconds, the trembling stopped. Sarah stared in disbelief again. He only relaxes when Buddy is near him. Dr. Reed nodded slowly. And Buddy only relaxes when he knows Milo is safe. The veterinarian crouched beside the dog thoughtfully. This is not random attachment anymore. Throughout the afternoon, staff members continued testing small interactions. Every single result pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. Buddy anticipated Milo's movements before they happened. If Milo wandered too close to furniture, Buddy blocked him gently with his body. If sudden noises startled the cat, Buddy positioned himself between Milo and the sound immediately. Once, when Milo became disoriented near the hallway stairs leading toward the lower storage area, Buddy physically nudged the cat backward before he could continue forward. Sarah felt chills watching it happen. He is guiding him, she whispered. But Kevin still looked uneasy. Or controlling him. Nobody answered. Around 5 o'clock that evening, dark storm clouds rolled over Portland once again. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance while staff rushed to finish evening routines before the weather worsened. Sarah carried fresh blankets into the kennel hallway while Dr. Reed updated medical files nearby. Buddy remained close beside Milo as usual, escorting the blind cat carefully along the edge of the hallway floor toward the resting area they had prepared. Then suddenly the entire shelter went dark. A loud pop echoed through the ceiling vents as the power failed instantly. Several dogs erupted into panicked barking at once. Somewhere near the back of the building, a heavy metal door slammed violently from the wind outside. Milo bolted in terror. The blind cat sprinted blindly down the dark hallway in the wrong direction, directly toward the open stairwell leading into the lower maintenance level. Sarah heard claws scraping desperately across the floor. "Milo!" she screamed into the darkness. But before anyone could move, Buddy exploded forward like a shot. The darkness swallowed the hallway instantly as barking exploded throughout the shelter. Sarah could barely see anything except brief flashes of lightning coming through the narrow windows near the ceiling. Somewhere ahead, Milo's terrified cries echoed across the concrete walls while claws scraped wildly against the floor. "Get the emergency lights," Kevin shouted from the front office. But Dr. Reed was already moving. "The stairs," he yelled back urgently. "He is heading toward the maintenance stairs." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. The lower-level staircase behind the kennel hallway dropped steeply into the shelter storage basement, and in total darkness Milo would have no way of knowing where the edge began. Another loud crash thundered through the building as wind slammed the loose exterior door again. Milo cried out in panic somewhere ahead. Then came the sound of Buddy sprinting across the floor. Sarah could hear the dog's nails sliding against the concrete as he raced through the darkness faster than anyone else could react. A second later, an enormous thud echoed near the stairwell entrance, followed by complete silence. "Buddy!" Sarah screamed. Dr. Reed grabbed a flashlight from the emergency cabinet and switched it on with shaking hands. The narrow beam cut through the darkness just enough for them to see the end of the hallway. Sarah gasped immediately. Milo stood frozen only inches from the open stairwell edge, trembling violently with his paws pressed against the floor. Directly in front of him, Buddy lay stretched across the entire opening of the staircase like a living barrier. The dog's body blocked the blind cat completely from falling forward. Rain blew through the open back doorway nearby, while the flashlight beam shook in Dr. Reed's hands. Nobody moved for several seconds. Milo slowly lowered himself against Buddy's side, still terrified but safe. Buddy did not move either. He simply remained lying across the dangerous opening while staring toward the frightened cat beside him. Sarah felt tears rush into her eyes instantly. "Oh my God," she whispered shakily. Kevin stopped cold behind them, completely speechless. Dr. Reed carefully stepped closer with the flashlight. "Buddy," he called softly. The dog finally lifted his head slightly at the sound of his voice, but even then he refused to move away from the stairwell until Milo had backed safely into the hallway again. Only then did Buddy slowly stand up and guide the blind cat farther from the edge. Sarah covered her mouth, unable to process what she had just seen. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew exactly where Milo was going." Dr. Reed stared at Buddy in disbelief. "Not only that," he answered quietly, "he knew the cat could not see the danger." Kevin remained frozen near the hallway entrance, his face pale beneath the emergency lighting. Earlier that day, he had insisted Buddy's behavior was possessive or unstable. But now, even he looked shaken. "That dog just saved him," he admitted quietly. Buddy ignored everyone completely. The large rescue dog gently nudged Milo away from the stairwell, one careful step at a time, until they reached the safety of the blanket area again. The blind cat stayed pressed against Buddy's side the entire way, following the sound of his breathing through the darkness. Outside, thunder rolled farther into the distance as backup generators finally flickered on throughout the building. Dim emergency lights slowly illuminated the shelter hallway once more. Sarah looked down at Milo in disbelief. For the first time since arriving at Haven Ridge, the blind cat was not hiding. He was not shaking uncontrollably. He was leaning calmly against Buddy as though the dog had become the only thing in the world he trusted anymore. Dr. Reed slowly crouched beside them both. "I was wrong," he admitted softly. Sarah looked toward him. "About what?" The veterinarian watched Buddy carefully for a long moment before answering. "This is not attachment." Buddy gently licked the top of Milo's head once before lowering himself protectively beside the cat again. Dr. Reed exhaled slowly, still visibly stunned by what he had witnessed. That dog made a decision tonight, he said quietly. He decided Milo was his responsibility. The story spread through Haven Ridge Animal Shelter faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, every employee had heard about the rescue near the stairwell. Several staff members who had not believed Sarah before now stood quietly outside Milo's resting area, watching Buddy guide the blind cat carefully across the floor one slow step at a time. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody questioned why the dog refused to leave Milo's side. Even Kevin remained unusually quiet as he watched the pair together from the hallway doorway. I still cannot explain it, he admitted softly to Sarah, while carrying fresh blankets into the room. Sarah smiled faintly. Maybe not everything needs an explanation. Over the next few days, Milo changed in ways that felt almost impossible. Before Buddy arrived, the blind cat barely moved unless someone forced him to eat or receive treatment. Now he followed the sound of Buddy's footsteps through the shelter every morning. If Buddy walked toward the water bowls, Milo slowly padded behind him. If Buddy stopped to rest near the windows, Milo curled up against his side immediately. Most shocking of all, Milo started eating full meals again. His weight is finally improving, Dr. Reed announced during a staff meeting 3 days later while reviewing medical charts. And his stress levels have dropped dramatically. Sarah looked down at Milo sleeping peacefully beside Buddy's front paws and felt tears fill her eyes again. He wanted a reason to keep living, she whispered. Buddy lifted his head at the sound of her voice and gently nudged the sleeping cat closer toward him before settling back down again. Soon visitors coming to the shelter began noticing the unusual pair as well. Families stopped outside the room just to watch the large rescue dog patiently guide the tiny blind cat through daily routines. One volunteer recorded a short video showing Buddy helping Milo find his food bowl by tapping it softly with his paw. Another clip captured Buddy blocking Milo from accidentally bumping into a cleaning cart rolling through the hallway. Sarah uploaded the videos onto the shelter's social media page late one evening without expecting much attention. By the next morning, everything changed. Thousands of people had already shared the clips online. Comments flooded the shelter page non-stop from viewers across the country. This made me cry. That dog understands exactly what the cat needs. Please tell me they are staying together. Donations began arriving almost immediately. Bags of food, blankets, toys, even handwritten letters from strangers thanking the shelter for protecting both animals. One envelope contained a simple message written in blue ink that made Sarah stop reading for a moment because her eyes filled with tears. Sometimes broken souls save each other. Dr. Reed quietly placed the letter onto his desk after reading it himself. That might be the truest thing anybody has said about them. A week after the storm, something happened that nobody at Haven Ridge expected. A couple named Daniel and Rebecca Foster drove nearly 4 hours from northern Washington after seeing Buddy and Milo online. Sarah watched nervously as the couple entered the visitation room for the first meeting. "We are not interested in separating them," Rebecca said immediately while kneeling beside Buddy. "If they leave here, they leave together." Buddy cautiously sniffed her hand once before glancing back toward Milo. The blind cat slowly approached the sound of Rebecca's voice, while Buddy remained close beside him the entire time. Daniel crouched nearby with tears already forming in his eyes. "I have never seen animals trust each other like this before." Sarah could barely speak. For days she had secretly feared someone might adopt Buddy alone because of how gentle and intelligent he seemed. But watching the Fosters sit quietly on the floor with both animals, she realized something different. They were not choosing one pet. They were accepting a family that already existed. Over the next hour, Milo surprised everyone again. The blind cat climbed carefully into Rebecca's lap and began purring loudly while Buddy rested his head across Daniel's shoes nearby. Sarah turned away for a second, pretending to organize paperwork so nobody would notice her crying. Dr. Reed placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Looks like they found home," he said softly. But as Sarah looked back toward Buddy and Milo together, she realized something even deeper had happened inside those shelter walls. The cat who once waited quietly to die was finally beginning to trust life again. The morning Buddy and Milo left Haven Ridge Animal Shelter, the entire staff arrived early just to say goodbye. Rain from the previous week's storms had finally disappeared, and pale sunlight poured through the shelter windows for the first time in days. Sarah stood near the front desk, holding Milo's medical folder tightly against her chest while trying unsuccessfully not to cry. "I told myself I would stay professional today," she muttered softly. Kevin gave a small laugh beside her. "That ended hours ago." Even he looked emotional now. Across the lobby, Daniel Foster knelt near the floor, carefully adjusting a soft blue harness around Milo's tiny body while Rebecca filled out the final adoption paperwork nearby. Buddy never left the blind cat's side for even a second. Every time Milo became uncertain in the unfamiliar front lobby, Buddy gently nudged him back in the right direction with his shoulder. "He watches every step Milo takes," Rebecca whispered quietly. Dr. Reed nodded. "Because he knows Milo cannot watch them himself." The veterinarian crouched one final time beside the two animals before they left. Buddy calmly lifted his head while Milo leaned against the dog's side, purring softly beneath the warm morning light. Dr. Reed smiled faintly. "You did something incredible, old boy." Buddy blinked slowly as if the praise meant nothing to him. All he cared about was whether Milo stayed close. Sarah glanced around the shelter lobby and realized several volunteers were openly crying now. Some had only known Buddy and Milo for a couple of weeks, yet somehow the pair had changed the entire building. Animals that once felt like daily responsibilities had started feeling personal again. Hopeful again. "You know," Kevin admitted quietly while watching the two animals together, "I really thought Buddy was dangerous at first." Sarah smiled through tears. "I know." Kevin shook his head slowly. "Turns out he was just protecting somebody who needed him." After the paperwork was finished, Rebecca carefully picked up Milo while Daniel clipped Buddy's leash into place. The moment the group started toward the shelter exit, something happened that made Sarah stop breathing for a second. Milo suddenly became restless in Rebecca's arms. The blind cat turned his head anxiously from side to side until Buddy stepped closer beside him. Instantly, Milo relaxed again. "He follows Buddy's breathing," Dr. Reed said softly. "That is how he knows where he is." Rebecca slowly lowered Milo back onto the floor beside the dog. Buddy immediately moved ahead one careful step at a time, while Milo followed closely behind him across the lobby tiles. The blind cat trusted the sound of Buddy's footsteps completely now. Nobody in the room could hold back tears anymore. As they reached the front doors, Sarah suddenly hurried forward one last time. "Wait," she called softly. Rebecca turned back. Sarah knelt beside Milo and gently stroked the top of his head. "You scared us for a while there, little guy," she whispered emotionally. Milo answered with a quiet purr while Buddy stood patiently beside him. Then Sarah looked up at Buddy and felt her voice break slightly. "Thank you for not giving up on him." For a moment, the large rescue dog simply looked back at her calmly with those gentle brown eyes. Then he turned and walked toward the sunlight outside with Milo following close behind him. The parking lot shimmered faintly from leftover rainwater while birds chirped softly from nearby trees. Daniel opened the back door of the SUV, placing soft blankets across the seats for both animals. Buddy climbed inside first before turning immediately toward the open door again. Milo hesitated on the pavement for only a second before following the sound of Buddy's breathing into the car. Sarah finally broke down, crying completely. Dr. Reed wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders while the SUV slowly pulled away from the shelter.